Okay, here we have an essay question for question 2. So, Maybelline and Judy were having a conversation. Maybelline said, "I can't understand why I bite my nails. I've been doing this since I was a child." Judy replied, "When I studied psychology, I found out that childhood experiences can shape our adult personality. Describe and evaluate the psychodynamic approach. Refer to Maybelline and Judy in your answer." This is a massive question. It is huge. So, let's check and make sure we can see our key terms, the things that we need to do in this question. So first off, we are describing the psychodynamic approach. Okay, because it's a 16 marker and I know this, my description is going to be worth 6 marks. I then need to evaluate the psychodynamic approach. So I need some strengths and some limitations. And then I need to refer. So I need to apply as well. And this is a hard one because we've got loads of description that we can do for psychodynamic, and if we're not careful we could end up describing too much and waste time, because it's these bits that are worth the other 10 marks, our evaluation and our application. So they need to be about 2/3 of our essay, description only 1/3. And I could get carried away with my description if I'm not careful. And that's what happened to most people who didn't do very well in this question in the mock. Too much description. And that meant that you didn't have enough time for your strengths, your limitations, and your application. So let's go into this. First off, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a think about my assumptions. The mind is like an iceberg. We've got the unconscious, the pre-conscious, and the conscious. So that's the first assumption of the psychodynamic approach. So I'm going to mention that, because actually the only thing that I'm going to really say is that the psychodynamic psychologists believe that our unconscious has a significant influence on behaviour. I'm not really going to mention the iceberg because it's not an application part here. Okay, unconscious is key to me explaining what is being talked about by Maybelline and Judy, but the iceberg theory isn't, so I'm not going to talk about iceberg theory. When I say unconscious, I need to explain what I'm talking about. I need to show that I understand these key terms that I'm using. So I need to say that the unconscious is a large part of the mind that's not accessible. And obviously this has an influence on behaviour. Okay? The second thing that's a really important assumption is early childhood experiences. Early childhood experiences influence our behaviour later on as adults. I can now apply. Okay, I'm going to slot my application in now. So I can say that a second assumption of the psychodynamic approach is that early childhood experiences influence our adult personality. This echoes what Judy says she learned while studying psychology. There, I'm already referring back to what is talked about in this conversation. Okay? Now, I'm also going to have to talk about psychosexual stages. because that's what's going on here with Maybelline. So during development of the child, they go through a series of psychosexual stages, and if they become fixated at any stage, it can affect their later behaviour. And now I'm going to go into more detail on this, because that's what my question is showing me that I have to do. It's got a full part here where it's talking about it. So I'm going to have to go into quite a bit of detail on that one. And that's going to be some of my descriptive marks here. Okay, I'm now going to focus my description on that, because I can't talk about all of psychodynamic. So after I've said we've got psychosexual stages, I would then say that Freud says that we go through a series of 5 developmental stages as a child, and these are marked by conflicts and different focuses for our urges. Okay? Then I've got to think, right, I'm only going to really talk about one stage. Which stage am I going to talk about? Well, if Maybelline is biting her nails, that tells me oral stage. So I'd explain what goes on in the oral stage, and then I'd apply it to our wonderful Maybelline. So, one of these psychosexual stages is the oral stage. The oral stage is the first stage of psychosexual development and occurs at around the ages of 0 to 18 months. That's what I would say. Here, the focus is on the mouth, and we get pleasure by activities such as feeding. During this stage, the id is dominant. Now I've got an issue here because I didn't mention the id earlier. So I'm now going to have to explain what the id is. So I would say the id is our primitive desire for sex and death, and it demands immediate gratification. It's the pleasure principle. So that's what I would say. I moved that up. Didn't realise you couldn't see properly. So oral stage, it's the first stage, 0 to 18 months, focuses on the mouth for activities such as feeding. That's how we get our pleasure, and it's dominated by the id, which is our pleasure principle, which is focused on things such as sex and death. So that's what I would kind of talk about in this one. Then I would apply to Maybelline and get some more application marks. Maybelline says, I can't understand why I bite my nails. Maybelline was probably fixated in this stage. So fixation is when you get too much or, zoom out, too little pleasure. In this case, from the mouth, in the oral stage. So that's what I would say. Maybelline became fixated in this stage because she got too much or too little pleasure from the mouth, and this manifests itself as its behaviour later on as an adult. That's the description that you need to talk about. If you think about it, we've said quite a bit of description. However, we haven't covered all of psychodynamic, not in the slightest. But we've got to prune it back, because we're only going to get 6 marks for our description. Okay, let's move on and have a look at our evaluation now then. So, let's try and come up with a strength. Quite hard to do with our Freud, but we're going to try anyway. Let's say one strength, my point is going to be that he's managed to treat some disorders, so treatment. Okay. My evidence or explanation can then be possibly I were to talk about Little Hans here. So Little Hans was a case study by Freud in which he came to him with a phobia of horses, and Freud, using his methods of looking into the unconscious mind, managed to cure Little Hans of his phobia. So that would be my explanation. Now, that's quite an old study, really. So I might put a second explanation in and say that recently a large-scale review has been done which has proven that psychoanalysis does have long-lasting improvements in symptoms. So I've got an original piece of evidence from Freud and then a large-scale review. Or I could really show off my research methods knowledge now and say a meta-analysis. It just means the same thing, but I'm showing off that I know my research methods. My link. This means that. Well, what does this mean? So what? This means that the psychodynamic theory, how's it phrased in here? Psychodynamic approach can be used effectively in the form of a treatment, or it provides valuable insight into how the psychodynamic approach works. Because if you think about it, Freud took Little Hans and then developed all his theories around that. So Freud actually used an evidence-based approach, which you could say this means that there is evidence to this approach even. Now, that's the hard part done. Finding strengths of Freud is quite hard. So let's come up with some negatives of Freud then. So point, I might say gender bias. That's my point. Explanation. He was ignorant of female sexuality. Go into a bit more detail on this one. So he didn't take account of differences, and he applied he saw male sexual development as the norm. Again, I can use Little Hans here. So, piece of evidence, again, Little Hans. So, Little Hans, Freud took his work on this boy and applied it to women and girls. So, gender bias is my point. Ignores female sexuality is my explanation. Evidence, he took Little Hans and looked at his development as a boy and then applied it to everyone else. Link, well, what does this mean? Well, I could throw an issue in debate. I could say that this means that Freud's theories are gender bias, which is an issue. I could even throw in alpha bias. So this means that Freud's theories show alpha bias, and his work shouldn't be generalised to females. So that's what I would talk about in that paragraph. So I've got a strength paragraph, a limitation paragraph. If I'm using this structure, where I've got point, evidence, evidence, link, point, explanation, evidence, link, I only really need one more evaluation point. Because it's Freud. Limitation. Now, one good way to get your marks for your evaluation is to talk about the research methods that are used by each one. So my point could be that he uses case studies, and these case studies that he uses were actually of people with issues. So an example is of Little Hans. Little Hans had a phobia, so he's taken the way that Little Hans worked and applied what Little Hans did to the rest of the population. But he had an issue, and everyone who Freud used as evidence had some form of mental health issue. So that means that it is unrepresentative of the general population. Link, so that means I can't generalise to other people. Hopefully you can see now how I would structure my evaluation. And I've made put several parts into my evaluation. Some people still only put the point, but you need the full structure in order to get that evaluation point. And this part, your linking, your this means that, is key. This is me signposting to my examiner to say, look, I understand why I have written this paragraph. I was talking to someone yesterday actually, and I was saying, if at the end of your paragraph you don't tell me why you said that paragraph, then there's an issue. So you need to tell me what your paragraph means. Why are you talking about this? If you can't think of why you are talking about this, then why have you put it in your essay? The way to overcome all of this is to plan your essays before you start answering them. So let's have our general overview. We've got our descriptive marks from here, and throughout this is when I'm going to have my application. So my early childhood experiences is when I'm going to refer to what Judy said. When we talk about psychosexual stages, that's when I'm going to talk about what Maybelline said. So that's my application sorted. I've then got 3 evaluation paragraphs, 1 strength, 2 limitations, fully expanded. Point, evidence or explanation, evidence or explanation, link. And I've done that for all 3. Hopefully you found this useful to have a watch of. Can you now please go back into your essays, see what you didn't include, see which bits you didn't do. Go back, replan it, and then have a go at answering it again for me. Remember, all in green pen.